I did it down there.
Well, I'll check out. Coming back now, stomping.
Yes.
I felt like I never feel
People know. What's that? Oh, yes.
I would have this whole outfit for come back. Strong, classy, and then the weather. So fashion.
Yeah.
Wake up.
And points it here.